Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. I am Dr. Robert Farley of the Patterson School at the University of Kentucky. Today we have a very special Foreign Entanglements because we're talking about an entanglement that wasn't really all that foreign, but was rather more domestic in character. This is a 150th, and you're probably watching this on July 2nd or July 3rd or possibly July 4th. This is a 50th anniversary edition of Foreign Entanglements, where we're going to talk about the Battle of Gettysburg. With me today is Kevin Levin. Kevin, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Great. And could you introduce yourself to the people?
Yep. My name's Kevin Levin. I live in Boston, Massachusetts. I teach American history at Gann Academy, which is a local private school. And you can find me online at my blog, Civil War Memory.
Right, which is a fantastic blog about the developing memory of the Civil War, which is a sort of a continuously evolving process over the years. So let's start out with the battle itself. So
Sure.
This battle happens in Pennsylvania. What were Lee's objectives in terms of bringing his army into Pennsylvania, and what were the Union's objectives? What did they want to do with Lee's army once they found it?
Sure. So the Gettysburg campaign really does get started in the weeks following probably one of Robert E. Lee's most decisive victories at Chancellorsville in central Virginia in early May of 1863. And coming off that victory, Lee hoped to retain the initiative, and rather than wait for another assault from the Army of the Potomac, he decided to march his army north into Maryland, or through Maryland and into Pennsylvania, for a number of reasons. It's June of 1863 as he really gets moving. Much of the Virginia countryside has been laid waste, the two armies moving back and forth. So it's a way to relieve Virginia farmers. It's also, a move to bring the war north. The war's been going on for 2 years. Many Northerners are experiencing war weariness. And Lee is hoping that perhaps a decisive battle on northern soil in Pennsylvania will have the obvious political effects of causing more Northerners to fight to end the war through elections. There's, of course, a presidential election in a year in November of 1864. And so he has some political objectives in mind as well. He does steal a march on the Army of the Potomac, and during the move north, the goal for the Union Army is really to stay between Lee's army, to watch it, but also to guard Washington, D.C. On the march north, the Army of the Potomac gets a new commander, George Gordon Meade. But by the end of June, the two armies begin to converge in south-central Pennsylvania, and on the morning of July 1st, you begin to see it's really the first day's battle outside of Gettysburg, which sits at a crossroads, and the two armies collide north and west of town. It ends in a decisive Confederate victory. The Union soldiers are forced to move south through the town of Gettysburg, where they end up occupying a natural ridgeline just south of the town, and the two armies will continue to converge in that area south of Gettysburg. On July 2nd, Lee once again...
If I could pause you, could I pause you for a
absolutely.
second, Kevin? No, and I think I sort of directed this way in the way I asked the question. What were the sense of the Southern strategic class with regards to moving it? I mean, so this obviously it couldn't have been just Lee, right? I mean, was this move seen as reasonable, rational by Davis and the rest of the Confederate government and the rest of the Confederate commanders? Because I knew there were other options, right? There was the potential relief of Vicksburg and other things that Lee could have undertaken rather than invading Pennsylvania.
Sure. As I said at the beginning, he could have stayed on in central Virginia and wait for another Union assault, but that is only going to result in wearing Lee's army down. And this isn't the first time that Lee has moved his army north. Of course, the year before, in September of 1862, the two armies fought just north of the Potomac in Maryland at Sharpsburg. So Lee understands that the Confederacy doesn't have an unlimited amount of time on his side or on its side. It's draining men that cannot be replaced. And of course, other war materials. The North, of course, has what appears to be an unlimited supply. So Lee is calculating, as he moves north, he's hoping for that decisive victory. Other Confederate armies fighting in the Western theater also engage in their own offensives, but they are less successful. So many white Southerners, Confederates, are by the summer of 1863, they're watching closely what Lee does. And they want to see an aggressive Confederate commander more than anything else, because it's a way of rallying Confederates, and it does represent, in their eyes, their best hopes of achieving a Confederate victory.
Okay. All right, so that brings us back to 7-2-63.
Yes. So, like I said, that first day is a decisive Confederate victory, and Lee, of course, wants to follow it up on the second day if he can. There are, of course, more Union units in the area south of Gettysburg now, and so he tries to get at them on two fronts. On the southern side of the battlefield, most famously at a place called Little Round Top, and then around I guess it would be the northeastern or northwestern side of the Union position around Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill. And there's some fierce fighting, of course, most famously at the Little Round Top, but the Union Army holds. And of course, on July 3rd, once again, Lee attempts to break the Union position on Cemetery Ridge, most famously with Pickett's charge, which ends up, of course, not succeeding. And on July 4th, and we should remember on July 4th, along the Mississippi River, Grant finally takes the key strategic position of Vicksburg, opening up the Mississippi River. But on July 4th in Pennsylvania, Lee's men begin that long retreat back to Virginia.
Right. So these combined blows of Vicksburg and I mean the battle was seen as a defeat for the Confederacy right away. Right. I mean there wasn't any. I mean with regards to Antietam, as I recall, there was some disagreement as to. Even though sort of in the demographic sense, Antietam was clearly a Union victory. But this was pretty straightforwardly seen as a Union victory on both sides, right?
Yeah, and of course, we can get into some of the details. There's no doubt that, many in the Army of the Potomac celebrated as a victory. Lincoln, on the other hand, he's happy, of course, that the Confederate invasion has been pushed back, but he had hoped that George Gordon Meade, would have acted a bit more aggressively on the retreat and prevented Lee's army from getting safely across the Potomac. The Potomac at that time was above flood stage, and he had really hoped that this might end it, but that did not happen. And so for Lincoln, it's not the complete victory that he was hoping for.
Right. Now, the total, just a couple statistics. I mean, this was. To my recollection, and I think to my knowledge, the biggest battle that sort of has ever been fought in the Americas. I mean, there may be some in the Paraguayan wars in South America, but I don't think so. And it's something along the lines of 22,000 dead total, or somewhere around there. Between
both sides, we're talking casualties, dead and wounded. We're talking upwards of 50,000 during those 3 days. Antietam still is the single bloodiest day in American history. That is somewhere around, between the two armies, around 23,000. But Gettysburg, over the course of 3 days, is significantly higher. Right.
And so Lee's army is able to escape, and then the war continues. Did Meade actually have an opportunity to engage, Is there any sort of consensus that Meade really did drop the ball in terms of not being able to do significantly more damage to the Army in Northern Virginia while he had it in front of him?
I mean, that's a great question. And, it's one of those questions that really depends on who you talk to. One of the things to keep in mind is that Meade only, was given command of the Army of the Potomac a few days before the battle started. And so, he's getting to know his army. And of course, you can't underestimate the damage that was done to Meade's army during those 3 days. So it's one of those, Gettysburg is full of what if questions. And that's one of them that historians and other Civil War buffs continue to debate.
Right. Now, and there's also been, and even at the time, there was criticism of Lee, right? And this, I think, sort of later emanated from Longstreet that Lee made some critical tactical errors during the battle. But that argument is sort of that Lee was too aggressive, especially with Pickett's charge, or
those in the period immediately following the war, the first few decades. There's a concerted attempt to really shield Lee from any kind of criticism. And this is, of course, part of that lost cause narrative that sort of begins to reshape the war or the memory of the war in line with what former Confederates, hope that everyone remembers. And so, when Longstreet goes at or criticizes Lee for his conduct, it's Longstreet that becomes the scapegoat, if you will. And he doesn't help himself after the war, as a result of accepting positions from the Grant administration, which, of course, was a Republican administration. So it's Longstreet that really becomes the scapegoat for the battle, and even to a certain extent, Jeb Stuart, whose operations, with the cavalry are come under question. But if you want, if you're looking for criticisms of Lee's campaign, they're much more recent, and perhaps the harshest critic, maybe some 20 years ago, was a guy named Alan Nolan, a lawyer/historian, and he criticized Lee for precisely what you just mentioned, that he had bled his army to death, that he should have taken a more defensive posture, throughout the war, because of course, he was thinking of some of the great victories like Fredericksburg, which is an example of Lee on the defensive, and allowing the Union Army to come to him. And so those are more recent types of criticisms, but I think missed the mark for a number of reasons.
Well, explain why. Why do you think?
Oh,
this?
yeah.
Why do you think?
Absolutely.
I think you've made a good case, and you've made a plausible case, especially, or a case that sounds very reasonable to me. That the Confederacy had to do something in terms of some sort of offensive to capture the initiative. Right.
That's right.
Even politically, it wasn't enough to sort of sit around and do nothing.
That's right. It would be a mistake simply to look at Civil War battles in isolation from, what's happening on the home front. And Robert E. Lee, although I think we still tend to see him as an old-fashioned general, is very modern in his command. He is very perceptive of what Confederates on the home front are thinking, what they want. In fact, when he is first given command of what becomes the Army of Northern Virginia, he's criticized in many of the newspapers, and he's criticized for his conduct early in the war, in which he did take more of a defensive posture. And the criticisms, some called him old granny, a stick in the mud. They expected that he would simply, do what he had already done, which is play on the defensive. And within a year, of course, I think he had proved all of his critics wrong. And so I think historians will continue to debate this, but I think we always have to keep in mind that these battles, that they must be understood within a broader context if we're to make any sense of them.
Right, and so especially we have to, I guess my thinking on this would be that surely Richmond understood that things were not going well in the West, right, and that there was no good reason to think that they were going to start going well in the West at any time soon.
And Lee knew this. Lee knew this in the spring of '63. Jefferson Davis suggested that he send some of his, I think it was a division in his army, to help the armies out west, and Lee did not want to do that. I think Lee also understood that their best chance was in the east.
Right, and so a defensive strategy would eventually have resulted simply in the Confederacy being cut apart, even no matter how long Lee could protect Northern Virginia. Right. But of course, and even Lee's army depended logistically on the survival of the rest of the Confederacy, and so defending Virginia was not a long-term strategic winner. So. And you mentioned a little bit about this before, about sort of how this the immediate or the immediate post-war appraisal of the Battle of Gettysburg, and this discussion of sort of Longstreet's criticism and so forth. I mean, how did memory of the battle develop in the later part of the 19th century, especially when the principals were still around and were still able to argue about it? What did the historiography of the battle look like for, say, its first 50 years or so?
Yeah, I would say beginning in the 1880s, you begin to see former Confederates and former Union soldiers meeting up in reunions. Small groups at first. By the 1880s, you do begin to see some meetings in Gettysburg. But perhaps the most significant event, when we think of memory of Gettysburg, is the 1913 reunion. Somewhere around 50,000, Confederate and Union veterans meet for, I think it was about 5 days, in Gettysburg. This is, on the surface, it goes to a great extent in promoting this sort of feelings of reconciliation and reunion between the two sections. And so of course the famous images of soldiers shaking hands over these stone walls, sitting by campfires and chatting. It really does sort of solidify that theme. Of course, below the surface, soldiers and Americans on both sides of the Potomac continue to push their own preferred narrative of the war. Northerners, of course, still pushing that this was a war that saved the Union. Many still, although we tend to ignore this or forget it or downplay it even still remembering emancipation. And of course, Confederates still hoping to sort of push that lost cause narrative, which at the center is this belief that the war was essentially about states' rights, sort of a constitutional struggle, that their soldiers remain valiant and that they should be honored above all else. But by 1913, the battlefield at Gettysburg is dotted with memorials, monuments. Those monuments are, I think, almost all Northern monuments. At first, Confederate monuments were prevented from being placed. That didn't happen until the early 20th century. And so Gettysburg, from the very beginning, was a Union shrine. And of course, Lincoln's presence there in November of 1863 helped that along with the dedication of a new cemetery for Union soldiers. They're not Confederate soldiers. And so, in more recent years, which we can get to a little bit later, it's become a site of for all Americans, regardless of region. But initially, it really is supposed to be a memorial to the Union cause.
Now, this is, I think, an entirely relevant question. How many, were there any African-American companies at Gettysburg? Were there known to be any, and I know you've written a great deal about sort of the myth of Black Confederates and so forth. But, are there any stories of, even in the sort of the baggage train of the Confederate Army? I mean, how many African Americans were around or played any role in Gettysburg?
Yeah, great question.
As far from what you know.
There were no black units in the Army of the Potomac. There were no black units in the Army of Northern Virginia. That being said, if you were to take a bird's eye view of Lee's army marching north in the late spring and early summer of 1863, you would have seen thousands of blacks marching with the army, and they would have been impressed slaves as teamsters and doing other jobs in support of the army. And you would have seen also, men marching alongside officers from the slaveholding class. These are men who would have brought their slaves as personal servants along with them for any number of reasons. And so I think it's important to remember that Lee's army is a slave army. It's a slave-owning army. So there are no soldiers on both sides. But African Americans, and we tend to forget this, are really at the center of this campaign. There's a free black population in South Central Pennsylvania. There's a free black population in Gettysburg, and some of these people live on what becomes the Gettysburg battlefield. And we know that as Lee's army, including the cavalry, move into Pennsylvania, they begin to round up free blacks, some of them former slaves who perhaps escaped, some of them free blacks who were never, who are born free, I should say. And we know that a good number of them, numbers are are difficult to pin down, but we know that the Army does kidnap a number of black people from Pennsylvania. And I think these are really important stories to sort of keep in mind as we think about Gettysburg, during the 150th, because this is not just a battle between, two armies. It's not as if we always must remember that these men didn't just fall from the sky and begin to butcher one another. I mean, there were reasons behind the war, and this battle affects people in ways that I think few people, can imagine. So they really are at the center of the story.
Right. I guess how would I think about it? Even once you get past or you sort of get past this wrong way, but you come to terms with the centrality of slavery to sort of why the Civil War happened. That it's not just that slavery provided a cause, right? That slavery was present in all elements of how the Civil War was conducted, right? In terms of floating the economy of the South, right? But also of the South's police state, right? And of the composition of the Northern armies. I think, and you actually may know more than this too, but it's very interesting to me that in terms of sort of memories of Kentucky's war effort, Kentucky is sort of widely. It is agreed that Kentucky joined the Confederacy in 1866, right? Is how we phrase it around here, right? Yeah. And we have even a statue of John C. Breckinridge outside the main courthouse on Main Street in Lexington, which I really think is to the eternal shame of the city. But it's one statistic to say that that Kentucky gave more soldiers to the Union than to the Confederacy, but then the secondary statistic to that has to be that Kentucky gave more white soldiers to the Confederacy than to the Union, which is why sort of Kentucky's memory, as demographics in Kentucky change over the years, Kentucky's memory of the war is much more as a Confederate than as a Union state.
I think that probably has a lot to do with the experience of Jim Crow, and then of course the civil rights movement itself, which of course, within it there's a very vibrant thread of Confederate memory. I mean, in terms of the Confederate battle flag coming out as a symbol of massive resistance. That really does go to sort of the complexity of Civil War memory and just how it evolves. Over time. It really does.
All right, so let's move forward from. 1913 is this, and we should remember here, right? This is 50 years after the war, and so being able to collect 50,000 people there in Gettysburg, and my assumption is that those 50,000 were not limited specifically to Gettysburg survivors, right? Because that would be an enormous portion of the army to have survived for another 50 years.
And of course, President Wilson, gives an address, sort of the unknown Gettysburg address on the final day, and it's a stark contrast with what Lincoln, of course, did when he visited Gettysburg. It was, of course, a longer speech, but the central theme of his speech is to ignore, as you were talking about, the slavery as the centrality, as central to the war and the cause of the war. He steers clear of all of that. In fact, he at one point refers to the war as the quarrel forgotten, and he sticks very close to just kind of acknowledging the shared memories of former Confederate and Union soldiers. But it really is sort of a way to rally the nation at the beginning of close to the beginning of the 20th century, as America's poised, was already on the world stage, but of course World War I is right around the corner. So he uses it as a way to bring the nation closer together. So that's another just sort of component of the reunion that's important to remember.
Would it be, especially in the context of Wilson, right? Would it be would it be more accurate to say to bring the white people of the nation back together and sort of not really the beginning, but solidifying the compact that leaves African American? I mean, Jim Crow has been going on for quite a while anyway. But especially with the Wilson administration and what the Wilson administration is doing in the federal bureaucracy and pushing African Americans out and sort of really in how would I again sort of thinking about this
well, he is a Southern Democrat. I mean, he is from Virginia, and so he's also, he also has to reassure, a good chunk of the country, that he's looking out for everyone. I mean, now of course he does premiere Birth of a Nation in the White House, and he considers it to be a brilliant work of history. And here we're talking about a very intelligent man, a historian in his own right. So he is clearly using the occasion as a political moment, which is, I guess, not surprising. I mean, of course, what president, wouldn't do that?
Right. So, moving on from the first 50 years, then, what does anything interesting happen in the? I guess something interesting must happen in the next 50 years, right? Because the next 50 years takes us into the heart of the civil rights movement.
That's right.
So, within sort of a more general notion of how the memory of the war develops over the next 50 years, is there anything specific to Gettysburg that really sort of becomes interesting in the way that people think about the battle or the war?
Yeah, there is one more reunion. There's a 75th in 1937, and of course Roosevelt shows up to do his thing. There were obviously fewer veterans on both sides who were able to attend, but there were a few thousand who were there, and I think much of it resembled the 1913 reunion in terms of tone. But I think as you are sort of referring to, the next big moment really is the Civil War centennial in the early 1960s, and I think to understand the centennial, you've got to sort of have the Cold War in the background. I mean, this is another opportunity to unify the country at a time when more and more Americans are heading to the roads on vacations, but to use these places to again sort of promote those themes that are going to bring the nation closer together. And Gettysburg, of course, will take place the commemoration will take place in 1963, and the centennial starts out with great promise. I mean, there's a very strong celebratory tone. Much of the lost cause and themes of reunion still sort of animate the ceremonies. I mean, there are a lot of reenactments, but of course most Americans are steering clear of the cause. And it can be safely said that this is a centennial for white Americans. The problem, of course, is that by the early 1960s, it's almost impossible to ignore the civil rights movement. So as, Americans are talking about, Bull Run and Antietam, and trying to imagine a war of just brave men without any cause, the unfinished legacy of the war itself is appearing on television screens and newspapers, freedom riders, sit-ins, bus boycotts, and it doesn't take long. In fact, by 1963, most Americans have sort of lost interest in the centennial. There is a ceremony at Gettysburg. If I remember correctly, it's Governor Wallace of Alabama who gives an address, of all people.
Really?
Lyndon Johnson also visits Gettysburg in 63. I believe it's earlier in 1963. And he does so as vice president. And his address is quite interesting because Johnson really does turn to acknowledging the racial aspect of the Civil War, sort of weaving together his understanding of what the Battle of Gettysburg was about with what needed to be done, what still needed to be done to deal with the racial turmoil. And so he's very outspoken. In fact, I only recently came across this address. The New York Times posted it a few weeks ago, and it's quite interesting. We have the transcript and the audio from that event, and it's worth listening to. But the centennial is a watershed moment in many respects because following the centennial, or I should say, following the civil rights movement, that really does mark a profound shift in how Americans will remember the war to this day.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting that you say that, right? Because, and I mean, would you? I mean, I guess that when I think about the sort of the shift, and that, that we're still debating the war, right? And I know that you, of course, do this at Civil War memory all the time, and not just with the Black Confederates, but also.
Sure.
But this was 1963 was a time in which the United States had a ballistic missile submarine named the Robert E. Lee. I don't know. I don't know if you saw or not. So, are you familiar with the Duffel blog?
Which blog?
The Duffel blog. It's the title of it, the Duffel blog. It's sort of it's a military version of The Onion, and they recently had an article in which there's this fictional submarine called the USS Nathan Bedford Forrest, and the article is about the first command by an African-American commander of the Nathan Bedford Forrest, and so they have him there, and he's repeating all these lines about Bedford Forrest until he becomes so frustrated that he just quits because it's so horrible. But I mean, I guess it seems to me that, and you know more about this than I do, but the real reevaluation of the war comes a little bit later than 1963. Or I mean, do we really see some significant change then, or is it a little bit later?
Let me sort of frame it this way. Yeah, sort of flesh out a little bit more of what I'm thinking here. I think the reason it's a watershed moment in my mind is because by the early 1970s, African Americans, especially in the South, are able to reshape the racial profile of local government, and it's really at that level, and even up to the state level eventually, where a lot of the political power that shapes how public places are used to remember the past, and even things like the name of roads, the names of schools, where all of that gets done or gets debated. And really by the end of the 1970s, it takes a little time, obviously, but places like Richmond, places like even Petersburg, Virginia, other places throughout the South, with increased political power, they're able to begin to sort of push their own preferred narrative of the war. And so, you see that today because, of course, you can't go a day without, hearing about, the calls to remove a Confederate monument in front of a courthouse or add something to a historical landscape. And I think, the only way to understand, the more recent debates is to sort of acknowledge just how crucial the civil rights movement was. And I think you're right. I don't think the civil rights movement, African Americans throughout the 60s, and even before, were still pushing their own preferred narrative of the war. They continued, in various places to commemorate the service of black soldiers, to acknowledge emancipation, celebrating emancipation in any number of ways. The problem, of course, is that they don't have the kind of political clout that would, allow them to sort of publicize it in ways in which white America is able to do, again, through monuments and other forms. There are a few exceptions, of course, most famously here in Boston, across from the State House, the dedication in 1897 of the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial. But other than those few examples, just a few I can think of, that really has to wait until later in the 20th century. But even in popular magazines in the 60s, like Jet magazine and Ebony, and in various other places, you can find this black counter-narrative. And what's so striking, and I was able to look into this as I was researching my own book on the Battle of the Crater, they were not shy in sort of connecting, their own struggles in the 60s with that unfinished agenda from the Civil War. And so, by the late 70s, there is that, you can see that shift beginning to take place. And perhaps, places like Williamsburg, Virginia, other museums, and, most notably, think of the influence of Roots in the sort of mid to late 1970s. You're beginning to see this change.
Right. Now, also, and I think it came out in the 1970s, but the Shara book, the Killer Angels book, came out,
So I think that's 74. I think that's 1974. I think
right.
so. Yeah.
Which, I mean, I guess I don't know your feelings on it. I've always quite enjoyed the novel. Believe it or not, I've never sat for the 4-hour movie, but
yeah, well, you're better off for it, I think.
Right.
It's look, I think a lot of people, it's their entry into the Civil War. It wasn't my entry into the Civil War. I've read it. I even had my students on occasion read excerpts from the book, and I think it's an entertaining book. I also think at the same time it can also be a dangerous book. I think it sanitizes the war itself, and I think especially now it almost glorifies war. And as a teacher, as a history teacher, I worry about that. I mean, we've been at war for the last 10 plus years, and I think we're a nation that is, disconnected from, the horrors of war. And, that books like that, I think do us a disservice. I think, I would much prefer these days for something that dug a little deeper into some of the muddiness and confusion of war. That's just my own preference.
Right. I teach national security classes, so but I've never assigned Killer Angels, but almost everything I do is sort of drenched in blood by necessity. So you were just recently in Gettysburg for a conference which was mostly about the battle. So we've talked about what happened in 1913, what happened in 1963. Obviously it seems that President Obama is not going to be there for the was it the sesquicentennial?
Yes.
Because he's going to be in Africa,
right.
Actually. What else is going on? Or maybe he's planning to go in November for the 150th of the Gettysburg Address. I have no idea.
That might be.
What is going on this time around in terms of commemoration of the battlefield?
Well, if you visit this weekend and into next week, I think first thing is I'm already hearing this from friends who work at Gettysburg. It's going to be very crowded, masses of people, as you can expect. Of course, the National Park Service is putting on just a host of different tours. I mean, the National Park Service does a phenomenal job of interpreting the battlefield. But so there's plenty you can do in terms of learning about the battle, and the war as a whole. The museum, if people are going to go, is worth the time. It's a great place for novices to learn about the war as a whole. But for the most part, it's going to be trying to find a way to tour the battlefield. That's really the central focus. If you're in Gettysburg, I'm sure a lot of people will be walking down what's called Steinwehr Avenue, where all the shops, T-shirts and other, Civil War knickknacks and souvenirs can be purchased. That's always a popular attraction. So you've got in Gettysburg, on the one hand, a battlefield where 50,000 people both were killed and injured, and then right next to it, in walking distance, you can search for ghosts and, eat to your heart's content and buy T-shirts and other odd things. So it's an unusual place, but yeah, it's
probably both the Bob Evans and an Applebee's there that brings America together.
That's right. It's a consumer-oriented place with what many people consider to be a sacred site at its center, and in some respects, it's very American. I'm glad I won't be there next week.
Right. Do you have any more thoughts on? I wonder if I suppose that it's inevitable that we will still be remembering this in another 50 years. Although, the way that we're remembering the Civil War right now seems to be undergoing yet another great shift, right? From my view, I think it's a shift for the good. But
yeah, I think it's a good time to study the Civil War. I mean, if there's no doubt that Americans still disagree about central issues related to the war. I mean, obviously, it is fraught with politics. Think of every state or governor that threatens to secede, that you're always going to get a Civil War reference along with that. I think having a black president, first black president, sort of forces you to deal with some of the tougher issues of race and slavery. But I think we're at a point now, 150 years later, with few exceptions, where there's enough distance between the event and now, where we can begin to, dare I say, look at the war objectively. And I think perhaps the most significant shift is, that we are, I think, more willing to talk openly about slavery, about race, about the participation of black soldiers. And, as a history teacher, I think one of the great legacies of the sesquicentennial itself is going to be just the massive amount of educational resources that's being, produced at this point in time. So, we've got our share of myths, and some of them I think are the result of this shift in, toward emancipation. But I think if you just think about a few decades ago, during the early '60s, we've come a long way, and I think it's still safe to say that Americans are fascinated with their Civil War. I mean, I think there's a danger in that. There's sort of an element of American exceptionalism still in our memory of the war. We still aren't quite comfortable thinking about the war in the context of other civil wars that have taken place. I think we still are perhaps a bit overly celebratory. It's an opportunity to retrace the armies of Robert E. Lee and Grant and others.
Oh my! But I live, so I don't anymore. But until 2 months ago, I lived less than a block from Ashland, Henry Clay's estate in Lexington. And the day of the sesquicentennial of the battle that happened there, it was you can just sort of look out and see how the Confederate columns approached the Union camp, and there was something so like the distaste goes away, right? And it just becomes interesting, right? Sort of when you realize that the Confederates just marched straight up Tate's Creek Road and then they marched straight down Richmond Road, and it makes it right there for you without. And it makes it fun without necessarily thinking about it in terms of the context of the political conflict. Right?
Yeah, and if it excites the imagination, then so be it. There is no other event in American history that does that, and I think we should take advantage of it. And I like the fact that we are a bit more detached from it. I think I think just having that healthy distance, perhaps is just beneficial to all parties. There's still the regular news items that I follow, because of my blog, and I think we're still quick to point out these deep divisions between North and South and black and white. I'm not doubting that they're still there, but I think I think we are at a point where it's much more complex than those strict dichotomies, and it would be nice if more people acknowledged it. But it does play up on the old saw of a divided nation. Perhaps we are, but it's probably along different lines, or more than just those lines than just regional.
Right. Well, Kevin, thank you very much. This has been fantastic.
My pleasure.
We loved having you on, and hopefully we'll figure out some way to have another Civil War themed, maybe in 2 years, right? We'll talk about. I guess we're in the midst of the sesquicentennial, right? So there's going to be stuff for the next 2 years.
We'll see if any of this goes into Reconstruction. That's what I'm really wondering about, whether or not we have any patience for commemorating the 150th anniversary of Reconstruction. But I have my doubts.
Right. No, I mean that will be fascinating because Reconstruction certainly deserves a popular reappraisal, right?
I think academics have done so.
Work on it.
Yeah,
academics have done so, but
yeah. Academics have.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say academics have done plenty of work over the last few decades The question is whether any of that, we can filter that down to the popular imagination. One of the drawbacks is we don't have any historic sites really devoted to Reconstruction that are devoted specifically to Reconstruction. So, if maybe we can, maybe that's the one thing we can achieve, at that time. Who knows?
Right, I have two almost 4-year-olds right now, and so I'm very interested, and the timeline will actually play out right in terms of watching and looking at how Reconstruction is depicted in their elementary school classes and their junior high and their high school classes, and sort of the attitudes that they develop. I mean, I certainly remember from mine, which was, that Reconstruction was this overreach of the radical Republicans, and Lincoln never would have done it, and then blah, blah, blah.
Right. Scalawags and carpetbaggers.
Exactly. And on that note, I think we will bid you all adieu, scalawag or carpetbagger, and thank you for watching.
Thanks so much.